All right, welcome back, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces and familiar name screens. I hope you all had a great break and were able to take care of yourself, even if that meant going on a walk, just as someone had mentioned, or just getting like some chips to eat, something like that. Yeah. So, before we get into the meat of the program, I'd like to just reintroduce myself. All right, my name is Amara. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a senior at Garfield High School. Um, I am involved in a lot of student leadership activities, such as the student government, the Congress of Racial Equity, which my colleague Haley is also part of, and Jaya. Um, and yeah, I'm involved in a lot of these clubs, which makes me really focused on learning about people in my community, connecting, building those networks, which is why I'm all the more excited to be at events just like these. Outside of school, I like to do art, play some sports, when it was safe, and watch shows at my house. So I'm just going to reiterate some of the agenda. So again, we are in our second half, our lunch after our lunch break. So yeah, we're reconvening right now. I'll go over the community agreements soon, and then Haley will give us a nice little energizer stretch break. We will have our wonderful youth speaker around 1:10, and then it'll be followed by a training, and then we'll have our closing. So the training will also include some discussion as well. All right. So again, some Zoom logistics and tech assistance. Looks like we're doing great right now, but please mute your mics if you're not sharing. And feel free to share your video. We would love to see your awesome faces. The session is being recorded, as you can see at the top. And if you'd like, please change your name to your name, pronouns, and organization. You can do so by using the participants menu, or you can hover over your box on your screen, and those three little dots will lead you to the rename feature. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box. Tristan is on tech support. Yay, Tristan's waving a little bit. All right. And then we also have these really cool things, reactions. I'll do a party one right now. Woo! If you want to reaffirm, uplift, kind of just second or agree with something, feel free to use those reactions, especially as our speakers are speaking, really helps. And as always, please take care of yourself and take breaks as you may need them. And again, I'm reiterating some community agreements because it's all the more important to make sure we're all on the same page and we're all fostering a comfortable space within our event, even if it's online. All right, so we have some community agreements, speak or I statements. So basically, we want you all to speak from your own experiences, listen, even though it's a very people will say it's a very simple elementary level skill. It's really important actually to be able to actively listen so we can build our connections and also absorb all the information that we're learning about today, which is great. Confidentiality, what's said here stays here, and what's learned here leaves. Acknowledge your privilege. So make sure that we're acknowledging our privileges as we enter these spaces, especially as we go into discussions. Step up, step back, monitoring your space. So again, if you notice that you're talking a lot and just contributing a lot, feel free to step back so that other folks have the opportunity to also contribute. And if you notice that, you have some ideas, but you're not sure if you want to share them right away or if you haven't been able to get them out, we would love to hear your voice. So take that courage and step up, please. Literacy check / lit check, because literacy, again, can be a hard word to say sometimes. So lit check, we want this event to be accessible, and that also includes language accessibility. So if someone uses a term that you're not quite sure of, then please use the lit check in the chat box, and we can best define that term to give more context so you can understand what's going on a little better. All right, Tristan is going to launch a poll. And again, community agreements and norms should be agreed on by our community, which is all of us here. So feel free to say, yes, I agree. Or if you have something to add, use the chat box and we would love to hear from you. All right. Looking good. All right. Thank you all for participating. And I will launch it to Haley now.
Hi everyone. I'm just going to reintroduce myself. My name is Haley Gray. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a sophomore at UC Berkeley, majoring in legal studies and minoring in ethnic studies. In high school, I went to Garfield and I worked at or I helped served on the Congress of Racial Equity, similar to Jaya and Amara. And at JFG, I serve as a youth program and training specialist. Next slide, please. So now we're just going to do a quick grounding exercise, a little bit of an energizer, just so that way we can bring our bodies back into this space. So I invite you to stand up if that's accessible for you, or feel free to stay seated if that's more comfortable. And I just want everyone to take a really deep breath in, and as you inhale, raise your arms up above your head and get a really, really good stretch in. You could lean to the left a little bit, lean to the right, and making sure that you're getting a really, really good stretch throughout your body. And then I want you to exhale and bring your arms down to your side and kind of wiggle a little bit, make sure your body's feeling nice and loose. Then you can grab one foot and try to see if you can stretch your leg out. Try to see if you can look like the little cartoon on our slide. Get a really, really good stretch in. And then once you feel good on that side, you can switch and grab your other foot. Really, really get a good stretch. Make sure you're really, really feeling your muscles working right now. All right, you can release that foot. And then if you want to bend your knees a little bit and take another deep breath in, inhale your arms above your head and just really, really get a good stretch throughout your body. Feel like a lot of times people just kind of sit at their desk a lot. We can get a little stiff. So it's just important just to move your body every once in a while, make sure you're feeling comfortable, taking care of yourself. And then if you kind of just want to roll your shoulders back a little bit, just get a good circle going. And then you can bring them forward if you'd like. Just really just trying to, take care of your body a little bit. Just make sure that you're loosened up, not feeling too stiff at your desk or wherever you may be sitting. And yeah, we just encourage you guys just to practice little stretches or do whatever you need to throughout the day. Just take care of yourself, make sure you're paying attention to your body and whatever you need to do. Next slide, please. All right, and feel free to distress in participating in our online puzzle again as well. So the link is bit.ly/beyond-puzzle2, and we have a new puzzle for you guys to participate in. You guys did really great on the first one, completed it super quickly. So feel free to just practice some self-care and by participating in this little activity throughout the day. And now I'm gonna pass it back to Amara.
All right, thanks Haley for that nice stretch. I felt some bones crack in my body, but I think that's good, right? Anyways, I am so very excited to turn the mic over to our youth speaker, Savannah Parker. She's an 18-year-old artist and performer who will be sharing a spoken word piece with us today. A fun fact about her is that her favorite quote is from a song called Spotless Mind by Jhené Aiko. It reads, "Change is inevitable. Why hold on to what you can have to let go of?" Please give a warm virtual welcome to Savannah.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks again, you guys, for this opportunity. As she said, my name is Savannah Parker. I am currently a freshman at DePaul University in Chicago. So that is where I am right now. So I tried to make, the background a little homey and festive kind of. I cleaned my room, so that's the best I could do. But yes, I'm so excited to be here, and so I'm just gonna share a few words that rhyme together and stuff like that. But I hopefully you guys are, will get something out of it. So my piece is called Overlooked. Okay, and can everybody hear me pretty well? Like it's not super foggy. Okay, awesome. Okay. Violence does not equal tough love, and self-love isn't a given, but it's learning to appreciate the being that once was, because she's gone through some shit, and it's forced her to be here today. Walking with a heavy heart keeps her grounded and from falling apart, though she wasn't born this way, emotions at bay. They say, sit pretty, act nice. You're strong, but don't be uptight, because the world is cruel, but it can do no wrong. Close your eyes, hum a melody, and move along. See, the sound of her heart isn't such a sweet song. It's bitter and a sombering sweet. What a treat it is, the gift of her vulnerability, a position that doesn't allot much tranquility. Are you feeling me? She didn't enter this world with the intent of being hurt, with a lack of self worth. No, it has much to do with the world, the people it fosters, and their mistreatment towards women, daughters, and girls. Our experiences are interconnected, but we endure them as individuals. And sometimes it's hard to visualize the struggle that's so personal to us, yet connecting our lives. This entire time, I've been pondering what to say to you, how to give you the hard truth without verbally sedating you. So I'll simply express that I can't tell you. I can't tell you why the world looks us in the eyes while pushing us to our demise. I won't tell you that everything is fine and that there's not a thing we ought to despise. I can't do so because I refuse to sell you a dream, a reality composed of lies. Still, I aim to shed light on the being inside, the person inside of you, because that is what we are, human. And oftentimes, we as girls and women are expected to uphold this facade, physical and intellectual physique. And while I acknowledge our strength, the expectation to stand tall and courageous while we are continuously beaten, well, that's a great feat. So I'll push the world to recognize the pain and the trauma and the anguish that is caused by its assumptions. No, I did not ask for the flesh upon my chest. I did not ask for your touch by wearing this dress. I should not have to seek your permission to express myself in a certain way. So excuse the profanity, but fuck your tradition. Open your eyes, use your ears, put your hands down, and shut up and listen. No does not mean go ahead. And if you can't get that through your head, return to general ed because this is not hard to understand. Violence upon girls and women is violence upon man. And I do not mean men, I mean human beings. Woman, I am. Black, I am. Young, I am. Naive, I am not. Hard times make for a harder heart. Her trust, my trust, your trust, our trust cannot be bought. And know that the way in which we are treated must be taught. So there is no, oh, I forgot, or that's not what I meant. Because there is no excuse for the loss of life at a petty expense. But I digress, because there's a whole lot more to be said about women dying in their sleep when all they were trying to do was rest their head. Rest your mind, body, and soul, because the path we walk is rugged and cold. Your worth exceeds the value of the earth's diamonds, pearls, and gold. You cannot place a price on what was never intended or designed to be sold. So, forget the world's assumptions and remember what you know. Let them know that no means no. Thank you. That was a lot quicker than I expected, but thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Savannah, for sharing. Yeah, I'm seeing some chats. Amazing, well done. I agree, times 100%. I really appreciate your words. Every time I hear one of your pieces, I'm just like blown away, which I love that. Very empowering at the end, and also I really like how you like said like I think one of your lines was violence upon men or man. Just like referencing like violence to women and girls that affects us all. Like that is really something that we need to be focusing on solving, which is what Beyond Pink and Justice for Girls and all these amazing organizations that are here with us today would are hoping to do in the future. So again, thank you so much for sharing your words, and yeah, please keep at it. So good. All right, thank you. So next up, I would love to introduce and extend a warm introduction to our fabulous trainer Andrea Wessel. Andrea is a sexual health education program specialist at the Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Institutions. Andrea coordinates the School Health Profile Survey and manages the implementation of Aaron's Law. She also is helping develop the Washington Youth Sexual Health, or WYSH plan, where she hopes to engage youth in the decision-making process. Andrea graduated with a bachelor's and master's degrees from Washington State University and is passionate about intersectional feminism, anti-oppression work, and centering the youth voice. Please welcome and join me in giving Andrea a warm virtual welcome. Woo.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. That was such a great introduction. Thank you so much. Let me get this going. So I'm really thrilled to be with you all today. We are going to be talking a little bit about sexual violence prevention and what encompasses sexual violence prevention in all of our work and our facets in our life. And so I'll just add a little bit more about myself. So like Amara said, my name's Andrea Wessel. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I do work at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. The first thing I like to do before I start any presentation is to acknowledge my privilege and intersecting identities that I bring to the table. So I'm white, I'm able-bodied, I'm cisgender, and I hold academic degrees. I'm also a survivor of sexual assault. And so all of these really intersect together to make who I am, in addition with a multitude of other identities, right? So I just want to cite a little bit that intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black woman talking about, she was a legal scholar in the 90s, and really focused intersectionality on Black women and their experience with sexual violence and also how it intersects with racism. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. I think they covered basically what I do, but I will say my position has changed a little bit. So now I'm the sexual violence prevention specialist at OSPI. So I get to play a really unique role with working with social workers across the state. I work with coalitions like Justice for Girls, the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I work with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and a bunch of other state organizations and school districts, obviously, across the state. So my favorite thing to do is to work with teens. I'm actually developing a youth advisory board right now for my program, which is the Youth-Centered Environmental Shift, which we will talk about later. And that's just a little bit about me. There's lots of things that make up my job, but this is my favorite part, is connecting with all of you and talking about sexual violence prevention and how we can all do that work together. So really briefly, I'm going to give an overview of what you should expect today. So we're going to do some intros or self-care reminder and a brief welcome. And since there's so many people, we're going to be using Mentimeter, and I have a link that I'll show in a couple slides, just because I want to know who's in the room and get to know you all a little bit. We're going to cover the various forms and the broad definition of sexual violence. We're going to cover sexual violence in Washington State schools, or what students have reported as sexual violence that they've experienced. We're going to talk about prevention and the social ecology of sexual violence prevention. We're going to talk about the YES program, and we'll have time for a small group discussion, which is like the last half an hour. So we'll have a discussion and then come back together, reconvene for a little bit, and then Tristan will finish up the day. So I'm really excited, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So traditionally, what I do is when I'm giving a training in person, I look up the specific Indigenous land that I'm on in each specific space. But this is my home. I live in Tacoma, Washington, and I currently am on the Puyallup and Coastal Salish lands. The reason why this is really important, especially when we're talking about sexual violence, is we cannot talk about sexual violence without acknowledging the genocide of Indigenous communities across Indigenous tribes across the United States, North America, Central America, South America, really the world. And so we don't say acknowledgement and like, that's great, thanks for your land, but also in terms of hopefully land back at some point in time, and also increased reparations for those communities that have been impacted by colonization. So this is really important, and I highly recommend, there's the site down at the bottom left, it's native-land.ca, and you can kind of, I know it's small, but you can look up the languages that are spoken and the specific treaties that also influence the land that you are located on. So I highly recommend everybody to do that. Maybe after the training today, it's a great exercise to acknowledge, and especially with the Thanksgiving holiday coming up, really important to acknowledge the Indigenous land that we all live on. And I know there's some community guidelines. So this is just, you know, I think we're all Zoom pros at this point, but right, take care of yourself. The conversations that we have today are super heavy. Sexual violence has impacted all of us at some point in time, either people we know or ourselves personally. So if you need to leave, if you need to shut off your video, if you need to do whatever you need to do, please feel free to do so. I would love to see your faces, but don't feel pressured to turn on your camera. Mute yourself, we already went over that. And then also, if you have specific questions that you would not like to add to the group chat, if you would like them to remain anonymous, please send them in the chat box directly to Tristan, and Tristan will read them out without including your name, so that way you can remain anonymous. Okay. These are my guiding principles for engaging in this work. So as I mentioned, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today will make you feel extremely uncomfortable, right? That's the point of talking about really tough things like sexual violence and racism and ableism. So I'm going to really challenge you to stay engaged and experience discomfort. And when I say those things, I don't mean like necessarily staying off your phone, which yes, of course, I would like for that to happen, but also really question yourself about when you're feeling uncomfortable or discomfort, and write down like a couple questions you can ask yourself are like, why am I feeling uncomfortable right now? Why am I experiencing like anger, right? Anger is a really common reaction to hearing information that's not commonly talked about. Rage, fury, right? Like these are all things that are really natural when we're talking about sexual violence. So I just want to normalize that. And as much as I would like to solve the issue of sexual violence today, we won't. So we need to accept and expect non-closure, right? Hopefully, if I'm doing my job right, you will leave this training actually with more questions than answers, right? Really questioning the communities in which you work, in which you live, the school system, the policies and procedures that we abide by. And it's important to question those things. That's a natural part of this work. We're also going to acknowledge oppression as systematic and structural. So you could be the most quote unquote woke person in the world. You could know everything to know about racism, about sexual violence, about ableism, about homophobia, heterosexism, any of those things, right? Any of the isms, but we still work for institutions that hold power and often commit harm, right? So we live in this dichotomy, and we have to get comfortable living in this dichotomy where we want to make change, but also acknowledge that a lot of the organizations in which we work for also commit harm and continuously commit harm. So that's something that I'm going to challenge you to acknowledge. And finally, we cannot rid ourselves, especially white folks here, we cannot rid ourselves of our sexist and racist conditioning, but we can do less harm. And that's the most important thing moving forward is we've all committed harm in relationships, in our friendships, with our families, in our romantic partnerships. And the best thing that we can do is acknowledge that harm and then change our behavior to do better in the future. So that's something that I'm gonna leave you all with. And can you give me all like a thumbs up if you are cool with moving ahead? Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm curious about who's in the room. So really briefly, if you know how to use a QR code, you hold your camera up and press over the QR, and it should bring up the first question, should ask you what field you work in. And I'm so sorry for some of the youth. I forgot to put student, but I totally blanked, but there's another option. If you can't work the QR code, you can go to menti.com and enter this code on the bottom, which is 5639517, or you can type in the specific link. So there's 3 ways that you can access these questions. And I'm gonna share that right now. Let's see. All right. So it looks like you can see it changing. Can everyone see the screen okay with the folks in the room? Cool. I'll give you a couple of minutes to figure that out. And I'll put really briefly, sorry, I will put the link in the chat box for folks that need it. Okay, we'll give a couple more moments. Okay. And then the next slide, it should change on your phone, but if not, or your computer, you can hit the refresh button. So the first question is, sexual violence prevention is part of my everyday work. You strongly disagree or strongly agree. Second question is, I know a lot about sexual violence prevention, strongly disagree or strongly agree, or I'm familiar with the intersection of sexual violence. There's no right or wrong answer also, like that's why we're here at this training. So if you don't know anything about sexual violence prevention, you're gonna learn today. So it's all good. And thanks to the couple of folks that shared in the chat box. I highly recommend using this tool. I use it, especially when I work with youth, because it's interesting to see stuff, you know, pop up live on the screen. And we'll be using this later. So you can leave this tool up on your phone in the browser. And then later when I have you, there's another QR code and I'll input the link again. But you'll be able to just refresh it and it will go to the next slide when we use it later in the presentation. Okay, great. Let me get this going again. So like I said earlier, we're going to be talking about lots of really difficult things throughout this training. So first, I want to acknowledge how sexual violence is a gender-based issue. It is gender-based violence is another way to describe it. And it doesn't mean that men don't experience sexual violence. we know men experience sexual violence, but predominantly women, all encompassing, right? Gender nonconforming, women who identify as trans or cisgender women experience the most of the sexual violence that occurs. And so since just looking, there is a lot of women in the room, so I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge your experience and bear witness to that experience, and also know that it can be extremely triggering. So there's a couple things, if you are feeling triggered throughout this experience, that you can try. First is to identify the emotion or feeling that's coming up for you, and to, I would say, look at it as like you're driving down the highway and cars are passing you, right? So we're not blaming, we're not shaming the emotion or the feeling, we're acknowledging it, we're seeing it, and we're not blaming ourselves for feeling badly or sad or angry or whatever feeling comes up. Some ways to address if that feeling is becoming consistent and you can't really seem to let it go is to take a few really deep breaths. In addition, from my own therapist, some recommendations is to hold something of an extreme temperature, like an ice cube, and it brings your mind to something physical. There's also the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is like 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. And that is a way to really bring your consciousness back into your body. And then, of course, like I said earlier, if you need to remove yourself and, you know, take a beat, take a walk, stretch, move yourself away from the computer, please feel free to do so. This work is difficult and it's hard and it's challenging, but I want you all to take care of yourself, and your mental health is the most important thing, anything else. All right, so we're gonna practice really briefly. I have these scheduled kind of throughout slides. So we're gonna, once it starts over again, we're gonna take a deep breath in, go. Great. So I'll leave this on for a couple cycles after we've talked about some difficult content. But at any given point in time during this training, if someone wants to call for a group breath, if you're experiencing or you feel like the tension is really high, you can put it in the chat as a reminder to folks. And Tristan, if folks put it in the reminder, could you do a quick interruption and we'll do a group breath together?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of the content. So when we talk about sexual violence, sexism is the root of sexual violence, or misogyny often. And a lot of times we focus on behavior that is overt sexual violence, like sexual assault, rape, murder, right? Like these are very high profile, often in the news examples of sexual violence. And the thing I want you all to pay attention to is this is an example of how norms contribute to sexual violence. So rarely you'll see behavior down here, rape, murder, incest, things like this happening without first that person, the perpetrator, doing these behaviors at the lighter gray, right? Having misogynistic practices or views, normalizing gendered violence or saying people deserve violence, sexual violence, holding extremely rigid gender roles, like this is how men behave and this is how women behave, and there is nothing in between, saying sexist jokes, locker room talk, harassing, and touching, like overtly, you know, ignoring people's boundaries. These are norms that have unfortunately become really accepted in our United States like culture and society. You can also call it rape culture, right? These norms that are really common that aren't really overtly addressed. And one example I can give within the school system is a lot of times this behavior goes unacknowledged, So for example, if I'm a teacher in a classroom, and the student is saying a racialized and sexualized slur, and they're disrupting the class, and I say, you need to go sit in the hallway, you're disrupting the class. If I don't call out the racialized and sexualized part of their slur and say that's not appropriate, it is offensive, the student may walk away with the acknowledgement of what I said wasn't wrong, but it's how loud I said it that I disrupted class, right? And this is an example of how these norms can be easily perpetuated. And it's most often not overt, right? The teacher may know that what they said was offensive and it's not appropriate, but unless we're calling out and actively calling out behavior by these people, then we cannot move forward and really address this issue of rape culture in our society. Okay, so that's just one specific example. It can also include family. Like if you're hearing like racialized violence or sexualized violence talk about and it's not being addressed, right? This is what allows these norms to become, these kind of values to become normalized in our society, okay? So there's a few other examples of like what this spectrum really looks like, or continuum, and we'll be talking about it throughout the presentation. When we are talking about sexual violence, the first thing I want to address is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, specifically throughout the United States, and how this is such a huge issue. So rates on reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average. And as you can see here, of the reported, this is important, right? Of the reported 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, only 116 were added and logged into the Department of Justice, like national database, right? That is a huge discrepancy. And so it comes, we can really see the intersection and the silencing of Indigenous women and girls and the erasure of Indigenous communities. And this is in the most overt way that you can see it. Murder is also the third leading cause of death amongst Native women in the United States. And this link, which I think will be sent out, Tristan, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is from a report from the Urban Indian Health Institute that's actually based in Seattle. But what they did is they did a national kind of survey about cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And you can see that there are 2 cities in Washington that are in the top 10 of the highest cases. And I believe they're unsolved cases. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in Washington state, we have so many neighboring tribal communities and reservation lands, and we cannot talk about sexual violence without talking about how it impacts our Native communities, and they are most often left out of the conversation entirely. And primarily when we talk about sexual violence, it often has been co-opted as a white woman's like feminist issue. And while all women deserve to be free of any form of sexual violence, any person deserves to be free of any form of sexual violence, we cannot address it unless we're working margins to center, meaning we have to address the most at-risk populations and address their needs and what's causing systemic racialized sexual violence. And then once we do that, we can start seeing the effects of how that benefits and impacts all women together. Okay. So this link the link at the top of the PowerPoint will send you to the report. And I think they've also, they have written a second report really critiquing the data collection that happens in the nation, but also especially in Washington state. So you have to remember that sexual violence is one of the most underreported crimes of any crime. And So these numbers are much higher than you could ever imagine. This is just what is reported. And oftentimes you have to remember when we're collecting data, it's what someone else deems important, right? When I'm collecting data, I'm coming up with a survey, it's information that I think is important, that I want to know. And if you're not, because there's so much erasure of Indigenous communities or communities of color, a lot of times they're left out entirely. So that's why this section is so important. There is a short video and I need to reshare. So I'm going to do that really quickly so that it is clear. Okay. Maybe. Oops.
The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous and violence against women cannot be overlooked any longer. In 2016, it was reported that 8 in 10 Native women had survived serious violence during their lifetimes. 50% have suffered sexual violence, and 90% of these cases have involved a non-Native perpetrator. I appreciate the recent work that tribal governments have done to shed light on the silent crisis of gender violence and violence against our women that have gone overlooked in Indian country for far too long. Most of all, I thank the Native women who have endured generations of systematic violence, who are 10 times more likely to be murdered and 4 times more likely to be sexually assaulted when compared to the national average. Further exacerbating this issue, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report states that crime and victimization in Indian country is caused by the systematic underfunding of tribal law enforcement and criminal justice systems, coupled with pre-existing barriers. In communities with the nation's highest rates of crime that are comparable to dense urban cities like Detroit and Los Angeles, I'm building on legislation like Savannah's Act and VAWA to provide our women with programmatic resources that will expand to urban areas where many Native Americans are frequently overlooked in this silent crisis. My work will also provide resources to families of missing women. Part of redefining who we are starts at home. Last week at the University of New Mexico, the first major public discussion of Pueblo feminism took place during the 20th Annual American Indian Studies Association Conference. During a panel, students described the presence of women and two-spirit people in modern tribal governance. One of the female students said, quote, "I am never going to be a governor or hold a leadership position in my tribe because these are only positions reserved for males." This is probably why Deb Haaland ran for Congress, because she knew she couldn't have political power within our existing system, unquote. I ask, is this the message that we should pass down to our youth? Some tribes continue to practice a European tradition of patriarchal governments that refuse to allow women a seat at the table. As another one of these bright young women said, we are survivors of colonialism, but we don't have to continue to live in it. To the students who organize this discussion to shed light on the issue, thank you for your bravery and your strength. Your leadership is what keeps me moving forward. I see you and I hear you.
Okay. So the reason why I showed that video clip is it is a really good descriptor of the kind of violence that happens to Indigenous communities. And I think you know, a lot of times, like what Deb Helen was saying, was like it really goes overlooked or under-resourced and underfunded. And so this is something that I'm really hoping to bring to the table when we're talking about sexual violence. The other piece that I want to talk about is also when we talk about sexual violence, we often leave out trans women of color, predominantly Black trans women. There have been 34 murders of trans women this year that we know of. And they're predominantly, if you can look at this chart by GLAAD, predominantly Black, Latinx, and you know, women of color. So while we're talking about sexual violence, it's really important to have an intersectional lens. And a lot of this is extremely heartbreaking. And so while we are going to be learning about the statistics, we will also end the presentation with actual key things that we can do in our everyday lives to really contribute to the prevention of sexual violence. Another thing I want to point out is that this Friday is the Transgender Day of Remembrance. So I would really encourage all of you to pick someone that's been a victim of sexual violence, a trans woman of color, and to learn about their life. And there should be lots of resources on the Human Rights Campaign and also GLAAD. I forget what they stand for. And then I also included a video here that we don't have time to show today because it's a bit longer, but it has a number of trans women that talk about their experience with sexual violence. And I think that that is something that you could also do watch on Friday as we remember those that have lost their lives to sexual violence. All right, I'm going to encourage us all to take a deep breath. That is really tough. So take a deep breath in and out. Great. Okay, can people still see my video? I, for some reason, lost all the video feeds of folks, so I can't tell.
Andrew, do you mean, can we see you?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, okay, good. So I'll just keep rolling. Are there any questions so far in the chat box or anything like that about what we've covered so far? Okay. So for this time, we're going to really focus on some of the dynamics and the definition of how I and many others across the state and nation define sexual violence. And I think the important thing to note is that this has really become part of a huge conversation because of the Me Too movement started by Tarana Burke, a Black woman, and unfortunately was co-opted a lot by white women in Hollywood. And I don't want to minimize or diminish their experiences, but we know that sexual violence impacts communities of color at higher rates. And so we need to make sure that when we're talking about sexual violence, we also need to use an intersectional lens about how that may be racialized and in those kinds of examples. So firstly, I want to talk about this definition of sexual violence. And I'm going to read the piece about the roots of sexual violence, which is there are many beliefs about why sexual violence occurs in our society. It's often seen as a criminal justice problem, a public health, or a social problem, and it's actually all three. And it's also a community problem. The issue of why sexual violence occurs is very complicated, yet it is clear that it occurs as a continuum of beliefs and actions. And at the base of the continuum are individual beliefs and social norms which allow sexual violence to occur. So remember the wheel that we just talked about. The sexual violence continuum is an attempt to explain how our norms and beliefs allow for an environment where sexual violence can occur and is actually tolerated. So when we think about sexual violence, this is just a more in-depth and more theoretical model of what I pointed out to you earlier, right? What contributes to the idea of someone believing boys will just be boys and allowing sexual violence, jokes about rape, the sexual harassment of girls in school. What allows that is looking at these as like the invasion of space, that we teach that it's okay to violate somebody's space in all these various different ways, right? Through jokes, catcalls, obscene phone calls, sending, unsolicited nude photos, sending nude photos to other people, and things like that. We also, contribute to the belief system that justifies aggressive behavior, and like the idea of someone owing somebody else. Like this happens a lot when romantic relationships start. Like if someone is on a date and buys dinner, then the other person owes them something in return. And then also thinking about what we teach children in terms of entitlement, right? What kind of attitudes are we really contributing? And an example of this is, what kind of behaviors are we teaching really young kiddos about the boundaries of other young kiddos, right? A lot of times we say, like, it's really important for you to identify your own boundaries, but we also need to be saying it's important for you to respect other people's boundaries, right? So that's just kind of an example, and you can read through this more extensively. But when we talk about sexual violence, this is a comprehensive definition from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. But simply, it's anything of a sexual nature that occurs without consent, right? So it includes rape or sexual assault, incest, child abuse, child sexual abuse, intimate partner sexual assault, unwanted sexual contact, sexual harassment, exploitation, flashing somebody, and masturbating in public and watching, or voyeurism. And so this is really important because, as I mentioned earlier, when we think about sexual violence or sexual assault, we often think of it in this very specific, to be honest, connotation. Especially, I think it's highly emphasized about college behavior. And we know sexual assault happens before college, but it reaches this almost like boiling point on a college campus with the fraternities and sororities and athletics, and this kind of, to be honest, like idea of entitlement to other people. Does that make sense for folks? I can't really see the videos, but if you have any other questions about that, just put them in the chat about the definition. So this is what I mean when we talk about sexual violence. It's like this all-encompassing definition. All right. One of the key features of my job has been really kind of expanding and thinking about child sexual abuse. And what does that mean for students in kindergarten through 12th grade, right? And how does that change as students get older? And the one thing that I've noticed is, because we live in a society that permits rape culture, and with that becomes like victim blaming culture, we usually put the onus of preventing abuse on children or people themselves, traditionally women, right? So for young kids, it could look like teaching them self-defense and telling them to learn how to scream no, with the expectation that that is the only thing that will prevent sexual violence. Right? We're not taking into account the norms and cultures that allow adults the ability to groom and manipulate children or communities. And then when students get older, what it can look like, and into college especially, it's like, what were you wearing? Were you asking for it? Did you lead this person on? Why'd you have more than 2 drinks at the bar? Why did you drink at all? You're underage, right? Like, these are all behaviors, and we expect people who who are assaulted to prevent their own abuse, which doesn't really make sense, right, in the terms of prevention. So we're really going to be shifting our thinking about, and I'm going to challenge, we've all had these thoughts. They're invasive, and rape culture is insidious, right? It's in TV, it's in music, it's in commercials, it's in even some of the toys, right? Like there's all of these really overt kind of thing, or overt and subversive things that we take in, which contribute to our thoughts and beliefs about sexual assault and rape culture. And so I want to challenge you to acknowledge these thoughts and don't blame yourself for having them, but to acknowledge that we've been socialized to believe very specific thoughts about sexual violence and how it occurs. So more specifically, when we talk about sexual assault, especially when we use national statistics, a lot of folks will think like, oh, wow, that's a huge problem in New York City, right? Or it's a huge problem somewhere else and not in my community. But this is data from the Healthy Youth Survey in 2018. So 12% of 8th graders, almost 19% of 10th graders, and almost a quarter of 12th graders have been sexually assaulted, basically. And I just want to point out that this data is people who have acknowledged being forced into kissing or sexual touch or having sex when they did not want to, right? So we can expect that these numbers are probably much higher. This is like a form of reporting, and we know sexual assault is underreported. It's important to also note that these numbers have risen significantly since 2016. And there could be a number of reasons for that. One is the acknowledgement in the Me Too movement that happened. And so there's increased awareness about what is sexual violence. It also can be that there are communities that are emboldened when you have an administration that brags about committing sexual assault. It may embolden students to behave in that way. And again, like we would expect, female students who identified as multiracial experienced higher rates of victimization than their white counterparts, right? So this is something that we would expect because of the systemic and racialized violence that occurs in our society. And I also think it's really important when we think about students who identify outside of the gender binary, like these numbers should be concerning at any rate, right? Sexual violence occurring to one person is too many. So what we have here is students who have reported experiencing sexual violence by their identified gender. So we have in 8th grade, about 7% of male students say they've experienced sexual violence, and by 10th grade, it's risen to 10%. For female identifying students, it's about 15% 8th grade and 25% in 10th grade. For those who identify as trans, in 8th grade, almost 40% of them have experienced sexual violence. And by 10th grade, 65%. Students who identify themselves as other or, maybe genderqueer, gender nonconforming, similar numbers, super high, right? 20, almost 30% for 8th grade, and then approaching 50% in 10th grade. So this is happening in our communities. And the important point is that a lot of times we like to say that this doesn't happen in our community, or, that only happens, in Seattle or in Tacoma or in these like big cities, but it's really occurring everywhere. The last statistic I want to show is also from the Healthy Youth Survey, which showed it asked students if they have seen a peer pressure someone to kiss, touch, or have sex when they did not want to. In 8th grade, it's almost a quarter of students have seen their peer do that. In 10th grade and 12th grade, it's about 31%, right? A third of our students in high school have seen someone pressure somebody else to commit sexual acts when they did not want to. And so this is, extremely concerning, and it shows that this is an ongoing conversation that needs to be happening. What we call at OSPI or in sexual health education field is sufficient dosage. you cannot just talk about consent one time and think that that is sufficient enough. This has to be thousands of little conversations happening from a really young age up until adulthood, right? There has also been a ton of critique, as I mentioned, when we talk about sexual violence and how we often have this like connotation of it just occurring in college. That's where bystander intervention training comes from, right? Green Dot and bringing in the bystander. These are curriculum that are geared towards college students about interrupting, right, violence when it's about to happen, right? So I'm at a party, I see someone that's passed out and I see someone trying to feel them up or take them into another room, and I interrupt and I say, why are you doing that? That's not cool, like you need to stop. And while we think about this as a form of prevention, it's not primary prevention, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because someone already believes that it's okay for them to manipulate and take advantage of someone who's passed out or drunk or on drugs, right? And so we really need to be addressing this way earlier than college. It's too late. And so if you are working at all with youth at this time, there's always a good time to talk about consent and affirmative consent and things like that. The last piece about talking about students is really considering additional intersecting identities. So students with cognitive or physical disabilities, extremely young students, we're talking like elementary school, students who identify or who are perceived as being LGBTQ+, students representing racial or ethnic minorities, or those that are being excluded, purposely excluded, and students who are out of home care or experiencing houselessness are all at greater risk of experiencing sexual violence than their counterparts. I think the other piece that I would mention here is that when we talk about students with cognitive or physical disabilities, or those that are intellectually or developmentally delayed, by the time that they're adults, 90% of them, it's like 86%, will have experienced sexual abuse in their lifetime. And most often, these students are the ones left out of any conversation about sexual health or consent or sexual violence prevention or developing boundaries and asserting their boundaries, right? This is extremely important. We have to be addressing this together and working with students that, those who may be in special ed may need this information more, especially because they may have caregivers and need to know when and how to assert, how to even come up and identify what their boundary is, and then to assert when the boundary has been crossed and whatever that means for them. I think the other piece to acknowledge is when we're talking about sexual violence is not about sex, it's about power, which is why there's a large intersection with other forms of isms like racism, because it is about power and not just someone being unable to control themselves sexually, right? It's about asserting dominance, asserting power over another person, whatever that may be. And so we need to be extremely mindful when we're working in fields where we have power, right? As educators, we have power, coaches, school administrators, law enforcement. These are all places, and the number one, I believe there are 5 kind of fields that to be aware of because they hold power, and especially when it's related to sexual violence, which is law enforcement, lawyers, clergy, school folks, and then also doctors, right? These are all people that hold a lot of power. And if some of you will remember, it's what these like cultures of not talking about consent or boundaries, and also unsure of how to question somebody in power and when they're asserting their power, is what allows someone like Larry Nassar, who was the Olympic doctor, to, I think he sexually assaulted almost 500 women over the course of his career. So this is why we also need to be extremely mindful when we're working in these fields to be questioning behavior of other adults that are in our field. And it's not to say that you need to be paranoid and assume that everyone has malintent or bad intent, but a teaching example I like to give is if I'm a elementary school teacher and I'm going into my classroom on a Saturday at the school, and I see another teacher there with a young student and they're alone and they're in a classroom with like a closed door, and I don't question that behavior, that would be pretty rare for that to happen and for any reason for that to occur. And an important thing that I tell teachers is because it doesn't mean that that person is committing harm, but we need to be able to work in a space where we can question behavior. And maybe that person is not doing anything that they think is wrong, they're not violating any boundaries, but they need to be aware that maybe that's not appropriate. And this can also be a learning opportunity for folks as well. And that's how we look out for kids. That's how we protect, especially those that don't have power in situations like being in a school. Like I said, question the behavior, not the person. And that's what allow us to evolve and shift and change as we work our way through addressing sexual violence and these norms that contribute to it.
Hey, Andrea.
Okay. Yeah.
We had a question, and I think it's a great time to ask it out loud since we're talking about students. But
Absolutely.
Anne was asking a really great question about your thoughts about, since the passage of the Comprehensive Sexual Health Education bill,
Yeah.
how do you see students across all grades learning about sexual violence now?
Yeah, that's a great point. So there are no, the only specific requirements that kind of contribute to sexual violence specifically and like in response to it is there is a requirement for bystander intervention training and also affirmative consent training. So that's a requirement that is starting, I believe, next year. It was put on hold because of the referendum being put on the bill. And affirmative consent is a really amazing way to have sufficient dosage and talk about it consistently and talk about it from a young age, right? Affirmative consent does not mean talking about things of a sexual nature, but it means engaging in any behavior with a peer or literally anybody, right? Am I communicating what that behavior is? Am I able to communicate my boundaries? Right, is it freely given? Is it irreversible? Like, hey, do you want to play kickball? Yes, no. Oh, you hit me in the stomach with the kickball. I don't want to play anymore, right? These are all functions of like how to communicate and that really can be tied to social emotional learning. If you'll recall, the bill requires social emotional learning from K through 3, and it doesn't require any sexual health education instruction, but social emotional learning does have a huge connection with sexual health education and talking about how to communicate my feelings and emotions and then also respect other people's. In addition, there is a ton of research coming out recently that says that comprehensive sexual health education is actually a violence prevention strategy. When I know about my body and how it works, when I know about respecting others, when I learn and I don't have this uncertainty based around fear of LGBTQ identifying folks, I'm less likely to commit violence against them, right? And normalize their experience and normalize everybody's experience, especially when they're going through puberty, is a really great way at addressing sexual violence. And then of course, there's the bystander intervention, which is, interrupting and being an upstander. For example, when I see something happening to another student whose boundaries is being violated, right? Which could include at elementary school, someone being bullied on the playground or being picked on and me going over and sticking up for them, or it could be at the elementary or the middle school level, if there is like a nude photo of a student that's being distributed, stopping that, not sending it, deleting it, telling an adult about it, right? And then that will continue on into high school and then college, obviously interrupting if there's more overt forms of violence. So does that answer your question, Anne?
Yes, Andrea, thank you.
Okay.
I imagine it'll be great to just be in this loop for a long time talking about how this plays out, because it's so awesome that we passed that.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I
Your work on
also,
it.
yeah, so I'm really excited too. I also, I think I'll send Tristan my webpage on OSPI. So I do free trainings like this. And I'm going to be doing an advanced sexual violence prevention training for folks that take the first series. So the first training is like 3.5 hours. It's like a more in-depth review of this, and then also goes into Washington state law about specific requirements and then best practice. So I would love to have more folks. You don't have to be a school person to even sign up. They're free. And I'll probably start doing those again more regularly in the springtime or after January, after the holidays. And then we'll be developing an advanced training for folks as well. So if you're connected or working with young people at all, I highly recommend it. And then you can also connect with folks in your community. So I try to do regional trainings. So that way folks working in, criminal justice reform or nonprofit sector, sexual violence prevention work, domestic violence prevention work, or social workers can all attend and be in this space together. And then also then it's like a networking opportunity as well, so that you can all be supporting students as we're trying to address sexual violence prevention in our communities. So I'll be sure to send that to Tristan. Thanks for that question. That was great. Okay, so I'm going to encourage everybody to take a deep breath. Okay. So I'm going to continue on, and right now we're going to talk specifically about the different methods of prevention. So this is kind of my wheelhouse. This is where I kind of sit, right? Is when we're talking about sexual violence prevention, we're obviously talking about different levels and how that occurs. So this is defining and addressing a wide range of behaviors and experiences related to sexual violence, which includes sexual abuse of children, sexual assault, overt sexual assault. It also includes sexual harassment, jokes, sex trafficking, right? There's a huge range. So when we talk about prevention, we're also thinking about it in a tiered approach. We think about primary prevention, which is like your first stop, your secondary prevention, which is your immediate response after someone has been maybe assaulted and you're providing services, and tertiary is long-term care. And how do I support somebody who's been sexually assaulted so that they're not assaulted again? I don't know if folks know this, but those that have experienced sexual assault are more likely to experience it again in their lifetime. So how do we support that person, that survivor, so that they don't experience another boundary violation like they already had? And I'll give some more specific examples, but my favorite way to kind of illustrate this for folks is using this idea of a stream. And when we talk about primary prevention or sexual violence prevention, we talk about like moving upstream. And what does that really look like? So first, I want you to, I'm going to read a brief story, and then I'll give some more specific examples. So first, I want you to imagine a large river with a high waterfall. At the bottom of this waterfall, hundreds of people are working frantically, trying to save those who have fallen into the river and have fallen down the waterfall. Many of them are drowning. As people along the shore are trying to rescue as many as possible, one individual looks up and sees a seemingly never-ending stream of people falling down the waterfall and begins to run upstream. One of the rescuers hollers, "Where are you going? There are so many people that need help here." To which the person replies, "I'm going upstream to find out why so many people are falling into the river." As you look further upstream, you notice bridges in various states of repair along the river. Some are strong, some are made of sturdy components, others are weak and dilapidated with missing boards and funky railings. It doesn't surprise you that most of the people falling in the river are crossing the poorly made bridges, and those individuals that live near or travel across the strong bridges are protected. of course, all of the bridges could use more reinforcement, but it's easy to see which bridges need the most attention. So we know that certain groups of people are more likely to fall in the river than others, as just described. They don't fall in because of individual weakness or intrinsic flaws. Rather, we know that some people are privileged to live in communities with strong bridges, usually made of high quality materials that protect them from falling into the river and promote their safe passage across. So when we're thinking about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, primary is going up and looking at what is causing, like if we're talking about sexual violence, right? What is causing people to commit harm? What are these norms? What is in the environment? What are behaviors that contribute to people, like the story, falling, like what is contributing to the weak bridges, right? As Deb Haaland mentioned, it's the underfunding of communities, it's historical trauma, it's specific societal laws and practices that allow for sexual violence to continue. So for example, when Deb was talking about 90% of sexual violence occurring in Native communities is committed by people that are not living on the reservation, that are predominantly white, cisgender, heterosexual men. There is a specific reason for that, and that is because I think I'm not sure right now with the Violence Against Women Act how it's shifted, but I know before VAWA, tribal police do not have jurisdiction out of reservation lands, and then also law enforcement do not have jurisdiction on reservation lands. And so what was happening is people found out about that and were exploiting that to exploit women and commit sexual violence against Native women. So what that really looked like is white men coming onto reservation lands and committing sexual assault and then leaving. And then there being these systemic, barriers to actually seeking justice for folks that wanted to seek justice and report because of the ways that, the logistics of who has jurisdiction over who doesn't. So when we're talking about primary prevention, it's thinking through policies and things like that are really impacting and creating an environment where of violence and aggression is okay. When we think about midstream or secondary prevention, we're really thinking about how am I supporting someone who is coming forward and describing sexual assault that has recently happened, right? Am I believing them? Am I connecting them with their community resources? Is there a sexual assault center? Are there advocates I connect them to? Am I listening to them and offering survivor choice, which means giving autonomy back to someone who has had their autonomy removed, right? If I am someone who has been sexually assaulted, that is a direct boundary violation and causes me to not believe that I have autonomy over my own self. So how do I support that person in asserting that they have autonomy and they get to decide how to move forward? And then what are the other needs that I can do to support them can I connect them with a therapist? Can I connect them with other things that can help meet their needs as they process their sexual assault or sexual violence? And then moving upstream, as I mentioned, tertiary prevention is really providing long-term support and services to people that have experienced sexual violence. One of the most fascinating things that I've learned about, and I forget the researcher, I believe he was Dutch, was looking at boundary violations. And he did so in this really interesting way. And he had people sign up for a study where they just sat in a room and he was chatting, the researcher was chatting to them. And what he did was he took his tea bag out of his tea and would move it closer to the person he was talking to's face until they said, no, stop, don't do that. And what he found was all the subjects in the study were women, but what he found was people who had not been sexually assaulted or experienced sexual violence would say pretty close, like pretty right away, like, why are you entering my space? And women who experienced sexual violence let the tea bag come really close to their face before they said anything. And that shows how boundaries can be really impacted after you've experienced sexual assault. So how do we, and that's why survivor choice is so important, to reassert that someone has the autonomy and the ability to assert their boundary and communicate and give them ways to communicate when their boundary has been violated. So these are what we're thinking of long-term support, and we're hoping to do all of this work together. The important piece to note is that you cannot prevent sexual violence in just one of these areas, right? It doesn't just happen in primary prevention or just secondary prevention or just tertiary prevention. You need all three as this comprehensive support system to support survivors and victims of sexual assault or sexual violence. I think the important piece to note is we really live in the secondary prevention piece, right? Which also can include risk reduction, which are like the tactics that we tell women to prevent sexual violence from occurring to them. And the problem is that we don't focus enough on the actual norms that contribute to the violence. We instead focus more on the response and the immediate preventative measures, right? Like, I carry my keys between my fists when I'm walking, or I don't walk at night, or I don't walk in unlit areas, right? These are important things about safety, but we shouldn't focus on only these pieces and expect that sexual violence is inevitable and will never change and will always happen. We need to shift our focus to really thinking about how do we change the environment in which we live so that sexual violence is not occurring and is not, you know, we really can make change for our communities. Does that make sense for folks? Let me know if you, we're going to shift gears again. So let me know if you have any questions. Okay. So I'm going to throw another model at you. And this is the socio-ecological model of sexual violence prevention. So this is really housed in prevention work that doesn't just have to deal with sexual violence, although this model is specific to sexual violence. And on top of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, which can happen within each of these bubbles, this is also a method for making change in communities, right? So we have individual change, which happens on a one-on-one level, or like a personal level, right? There's a relationship change, which is me with another person or a few other people, or maybe my family. There's community change, which could be my school or my workplace or my community in which I live. And then there's also societal change that is this cultural norms or that really impact the environment in which we live and breathe. So a lot of times when we look at these models, these like, they kind of look longitudinal, right? Where it's like you go from the individual to the relationship to the community and to the societal. I think the important thing to note is that change has to happen on all of these levels, and it doesn't have to just start at one and work its way down, or one and work its way up, right? We don't just start at the individual and work our way to societal. We don't just start at the societal and work our way down to the individual. Although those can happen, there can also be change that's occurring in the relationship and the community, and that impacts the relationship again, and then impacts the community, and then impacts the individual. So think of like little arrows flowing all the way through here, and it's like, oh, maybe we'll go back here and here and here and here. But it's important to note that this model is, change has to happen on all of these models to really make systemic long-term change about sexual violence. All right, and this is what the Centers for Disease Control, when they're doing rape prevention education, they really use and focus on this model. And what I'll be talking about in a little bit is we're currently working on something that's impacting the community part of the social ecology of preventing sexual violence. And so I'll be able to give you a more distinct example in a few minutes. So when we are talking about sexual violence, there is kind of these various strategies that have been maybe like approved or research-based, like evidence-informed from the Centers for Disease Control. And so you can see on the left-hand side, you have your letters STOP SV, which is an acronym. So, right, the first strategy is social norms that protect against violence, right? So this can be bystander approaches. It can be mobilizing men and boys as allies. These are approaches that really contribute to those social norms. T would stand for teach skills to prevent sexual violence, right? So promoting healthy sexuality, as I mentioned earlier, like comprehensive sexual health education. How do we have empowerment-based training where we're talking about our boundaries and our autonomy? Increasing social emotional learning, right? I can communicate my boundaries, I respect other people's boundaries. And talking about healthy relationships is super important, and that starts at a young age also. What does my healthy relationship look like with my parents, with my caregivers, with my guardians, with my grandparents, with my siblings, with my friends, with my teacher, with my principal, right? Like these are all examples of other relationships and how to demonstrate what a healthy relationship looks like. Are we providing opportunities to empower and support girls and women, which means economic supports, or again, providing leadership opportunities for women and girls? And then P, creating protective environments. So how are we improving safety and monitoring in all areas, but specifically and especially schools? How are we dealing with workplace policies and making sure that all of our employees are protected? And how do we utilize community level or address community level risks through changing the environment in which people are operating in? And then of course, we see the support victims and survivors to lessen harm. So how are we providing victim-centered services or survivor-centered services? How do we include survivor choice? What treatments are we providing for people or survivors who have experienced sexual violence? And then what are we doing for at-risk families or at-risk kids so that we don't have increased behavior or increased perpetration of sexual violence? So today, when we talk about the YES program, what that really is focusing on is creating a protective environment for students. And then I have a couple more examples of when we think about sexual violence. Here is like a really good example of how these behaviors and beliefs and attitudes really increase or contribute to sexual assault, sexual violence, murder, suicide, right? And you can see how they all kind of stack on top of each other if they're not being addressed. And here is another example. So this is really looking at rape culture and some of these things that I know you all have dealt with, right? So let me know if you have any specific questions about any of these. Some people might not know what stealthing is, but stealthing is a form of rape, which is someone agreeing to sexual activity with a condom and then the person removing that condom without the other person's knowledge. And this is becoming increasingly common on college campuses and in some students who are in high school. And so that's really important to acknowledge. Also, revenge pornography or revenge porn happens where someone will send photos out or post them on people's Instagrams or like social media or Snapchat without the other person's consent. Forcing someone to watch pornography is non-consensual imagery, right? Coercion, right? These are all kind of overt behaviors, but things that we may not associate it specifically with rape or rape culture. And then you can see some of the other normalized behaviors: flashing, catcalling, unsolicited nude pictures, unwanted non-sexual touching, right? That's a boundary violation. If I'm going through the hallway and I'm touching people without asking first, hugging people without asking, these are all examples of normalization. And unfortunately, when you see and acknowledge rape culture as as it is right now, it's extremely hard to, you cannot unsee it. You see it in movies, you hear it in music, you hear it and see it everywhere. And so, but we have to see it to acknowledge it and to change it, right? All right, let's do another group breath. So I'm gonna wait until this goes down, and then we're gonna take a deep breath in. And a deep breath out. Okay. So we are gonna take a 5-minute break. So do whatever you need to do. If you need to get water, stretch, do some of the stretches that we were doing before the presentation started. And I have Mentimeter is going to be up again. So I wonder if I think I have both my screens showing. So let me hold on a second. So this is a word cloud. So you should all be able to just refresh your screen. And here is an emotion wheel of what you are feeling. So feel free to input as many times as you want. I think you can just keep refreshing it and input as many emotions as you're feeling. You also can really go above and beyond. If there's an emotion that you're not, that's not on this wheel, please feel free to go ahead and input it on there. And then we will come back at 2:41, and we should be heading to small groups around 3. So I will see you in 5 minutes.
Andrea, are you able to add that Mentimeter link again?
Yes, let me add that really quickly.
Cool. Thank you.
Tristan, can you see both screens? Is it distracting?
I can, but it's really blurry for me. Like I can't read any of the words. I don't know if that's just me. Yeah, it is blurry, isn't
Blurry.
it, Shelley? Huh.
It might be too much, so I'm just going to put this one up. That way it's,
Okay. Oh yeah.
is it blurry for you still?
It's a tiny bit blurry, but I can see for the most part at least the words in the middle.
Okay, so we're gonna get back, I'm gonna bring folks back. So lots of really great feedback, overwhelmed. Yeah, this is really a lot of overwhelming information, but we're gonna be ending with positive ideas of how we can make change, even if we don't work in schools, right? Triggered, make sure you're taking care of yourself, drink water. Hopeful. I am hopeful, like that's why I'm doing this work, is I'm hopeful that we can make change and move the needle forward in addressing sexual violence. And how do we really do this work together in our communities? Frustrated, angry, anger, exhausted, stressed, disgust. These are all very natural feelings to a lot of this content. So I just kind of want to normalize. I want to normalize that. I want to thank you for participating and being a part of this challenging work. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me try to reshare. I don't want it to get blurry again, so I'm going to reshare. So now I get to tell you about these really exciting work that's happening. So I developed this program out of the response of Erin's Law. So Erin's Law passed in 2018. It was a child sexual abuse prevention bill, and it passed and we wrote rules for it. And the requirement was you need to do a bunch of like a curriculum review of all existing curricula, which was like how in the world. So we ended up reviewing about 60 materials and ended up, I think, having 40 full reviews of different materials, whether they're a short video all the way to comprehensive curriculum and how they addressed primary prevention, right? The initial idea of that primary prevention or prevention is possible, and here's how we address some of the norms and change the norms around that allow sexual violence to occur. And I remember sitting in a meeting, we had a huge work group meeting with folks from all across the state. And someone's like, you know, I really wish I knew more about sexual violence prevention. I feel like now that I know more, my mind is completely open and I'm aware. It's like eyes wide open kind of thing. And so I was like, that's actually a really good idea. So I wrote a grant and developed this program. So it's called the YES, it's Youth-Centered Environmental Shift. And basically it's this idea that I had to create a culture where students are emotionally and physically safe, supported, and free of abuse, specifically talking about sexual violence. And the goal of this program is to work with middle schools that have grades 6, 7, and 8 in non-urban communities. And the reason why is most sexual violence research or research on sexual assault and support for victims or survivors of sexual assault, they're tapped and they're totally swamped, but there are quite a few programs in metropolitan areas like Seattle and Tacoma, but often our rural communities, which have extremely high Latinx and migrant populations, are often left without any resources or support. And then also focusing on middle school is like the prime age for really learning how to understand my own body and my own boundaries and my own autonomy, and also learn how to respect another of my peers. And then also you're starting to get into romantic relationships throughout middle school. So the goal of this work is really to partner with schools and create this like scaffolded approach, which we would call the school support team or SSTs. And we are making sure that we're including an administrator, an educator, a counselor or a school nurse, a paraeducator, another school support staff, and a district representative. And the reason for doing that is to show the variety of relationships that students have with all of these administrative or school staff that work within our middle schools. My relationship, like I remember I had my favorite teacher, but my relationship with my teacher is not going to be the same as my administrator. And if I have in a meeting with a school nurse or a school counselor, or maybe I have a really close relationship with my school counselor, that relationship is going to be really different than maybe what I have with one of my teachers, and so on and so forth, right? Especially paraeducators who work with students so closely and often may be working with students with intellectual or developmental disabilities and know how to provide support to those students. So the idea is that this school support team will be working extremely closely with the students in the middle school to help develop and create an environment that is free of sexual violence. The second component, which is the big one, is school climate and environmental shift. So we're going to do that by partnering with students through focus groups and working with students to develop their own assessments of the physical, cultural, and social space of the school, right? A lot of times we think about, when we think about school climate, we think about like, well, especially at OSPI even, we think a lot about the physical safety, right? We want students to be physically safe when they're entering a school, but what about socially and culturally? Like, do they feel culturally safe to enter a building and be who they are? Do they feel socially safe to be amongst their peers? And what does that really look like? And so the students will be partnering with the school support teams to develop like some of the assessments, like they're just going to be multiple choice questions, like how do you feel when? Are you comfortable? Have you experienced sexual violence, which includes X, Y, and Z, like in the hallways, during PE, like in the lunchroom, right? These common places that we know sexual violence may be occurring or sexual harassment may be occurring. The other component of the environmental shift is also hotspot mapping. So it's this idea that came out of, it's a middle school program called Shifting Boundaries. So we're going to be utilizing a component of that where students would get a map of the school and they basically color in with pencils or markers or crayons. Red for I do not feel safe. Yellow is sometimes I feel safe and sometimes I do feel safe and sometimes I don't. And green is I always feel safe or most predominantly feel safe in this space. And this is down to the level of like classroom, right? So this is important for school support teams to really identify how students are feeling throughout the school building. If there's a specific hallway, right? Do we need more monitoring in that hallway? Do we need to, you know, put more teachers or paras, or do we need to have like, you know, student patrol like during the hallway to make sure that students aren't being bullied or experiencing sexual harassment? This also means that this is a way for students to hold teachers accountable who may be saying things that are inappropriate or making them feel unsafe in the classroom, right? I think a major component of, especially when I work with teens, is acknowledging how little autonomy students have within the school day and within their classrooms, right? We always encourage teachers to use various approaches when they're teaching students, so students have choice and autonomy, right? You have to do this assignment and show your learning. Here are a number of options of how you can do that, right? That's a form of showing autonomy and allowing students to choose what's best for them. But besides that, it's pretty rare where students get to fully be autonomous in their choice and how they operate throughout the school building during the day. And so how are more ways that we can give students power to take accountability for their environment, even if that means holding a teacher accountable that makes them feel uncomfortable or unsafe? Most of the time when we talk about sexual harassment, we think of peer-on-peer, which occurs, of course, but we don't think about teachers who may be displaying inappropriate relationships with students, and that's important too. We can't only focus on one part of sexual violence. We need to look at it as a comprehensive picture. And the last piece is really addressing the policies and procedures that are in place during our schools that contribute to sexual violence. And the number one cause of that is dress code. Dress code is a method of racialized and sexualized violence. And what happens is most dress codes, right, we have a requirement in our state that dress codes need to be gender neutral, right? That is like a civil rights law. But I can't tell you how many dress codes I've seen that are not gender neutral, that specifically bring up cleavage or girls midriff, or specific dress codes for school dances that are specific to genders. And And it is one of the leading causes of discipline, which is removing students from educational time in the classroom. And what kind of message does that send students when I say your body is an ornament and is distracting other people, and therefore your education is less important than you leaving the classroom because you're a distraction? So it's really addressing these like long withstanding held beliefs about what is appropriate and usually deemed appropriate for girls or like, you know, female presenting students, and how to not be a distraction to their male students. And we've seen this time and time again. Like there are examples where principals have made students, like female students, get on their knees in the middle of the hallway to check their hemline on their skirt, right? And we think back and we say like, how could that even happen? But it's so ingrained, these norms about girls' bodies and sexualizing them from such a young age, that this has to be addressed. And this is a major component of the YES program, is really addressing it through this specific policy and procedure. And then in addition, there's also education pieces about what is sexual harassment. So for example, when I talked earlier about when we call out a student who may be overtly, you know, using sexist slurs in the classroom, right? We need to identify that as sexual harassment and make sure that all teachers are aware of what constitutes sexual harassment so that it can be addressed, and hopefully in a restorative justice fashion, not just kicking students out of the classroom so that they are not engaging in learning. That's not something that I ever want, or people who advocate for education really want. But how do we address it so that all students feel safe and supported? So ideally, right, with all of these three things, right, we're having partnerships between school staff and the program. There's a continued partnership between students and the school support team to measure safety and support that's in addressing sexual violence prevention within the school building, and then a revision and adoption of new policies, specifically dress code, and then, excuse me, increased training of staff about sexual violence and policies that intersect with sexual violence. What we would expect to see is decreased, like specifically decrease in forms of sexual violence, including sexual harassment, decreases in teen dating violence, and we would also see decreases in bullying and other youth violence. But what we can also expect is we're addressing school climate, which means more positive school climate, which means less like increased attendance for students. We should also see decreased attitudes towards any form of violence, increased bystander interventions and intentions, right? My intention is if I see something, I'm gonna intervene and act, or, and I feel like I have the self-efficacy to do so. And then also we should see increased academic achievement amongst all students and decreased discipline, right? We're not removing students from class for wearing jeans with holes in it, right? Like these are some of the things that we really want to be addressing and talking about. So this is like the major components. And if anyone is from a non-urban middle school, email me. There's going to be an iGrants form package that's going to be sent out so schools can apply. It's basically a request for proposal to participate in this pilot project, and it's going to be starting in February. So this is another example of all of the things that we're going to be doing. Oh, I did forget, there's a social norms campaign that's posters that will be implemented, and it is geared towards middle school boys, but it has proven effective amongst all students, and it's mostly talking about consent and respect. You can look it up. It's called It's About Respect, and it's on the Department of Health website. So it's something that they developed, tested, and is I'm really excited about it. So this is just an overview. I hope that this makes you feel a little bit hopeful. I know things feel, as someone who works in sexual violence prevention every day, like watches and reads research, like it is extremely strenuous. It's tough work. It's hard. But there are so many other things that make you, like, I hope you feel hopeful about, and changes that are happening throughout our communities, and just know that there are advocates working so hard everywhere across the state, across the country, to really bring the awareness about sexual violence prevention. I will say, so this program also got a grant to be evaluated by the CDC, which I'm really excited about and also scared. So it could be one of the first proven evidence-based sexual violence prevention strategies. It's never been done before, which is terrifying. And I question myself all the time, like, why did you do this? There's no model. It's really scary. But I just met with 6 people across the country. So there's 6 other programs that are being evaluated that are along these lines. And it's so exciting because you just know that people care so much. And this is something that is happening, even if you don't overtly see it in your communities, it is happening. So I hope that helps a little bit. And I think we're right on time for small groups. So what we'll do is there's 20 minutes. Tristan is going to divide folks, and there are 3 questions that you're going to be addressed today with your small group. So first is, what is something you learned that squares or solidifies your thinking? What is an important takeaway that you learned, something maybe new? And then what are ways that you can engage in sexual violence prevention, whether it's in your house, with yourself, in where you work, in your community, whatever capacity. And you'll be working with your facilitators and your small groups to come up with that. So without further ado, unless there are questions.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and put folks in your rooms. We'll reconvene in 20. And if you haven't yet clicked on join group, I believe that you have to select that before you're able to go into your group. So there should be a little pop-up at the top that says join.
Are you staying in here or are you going into a small group?
I am going into a small group.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. We've got a few more seconds before people are coming back. I put like 7 people in a room and some rooms had 2 people. I'm so sorry if your room was really small. That was not the intention, but
Tristan, we had like 3 people in my room.
you know,
It
I
was sweet and cute.
I'm glad you say that.
It's okay.
Adonette, you're amazing. I swear there were like 7 people and I hit go, and then either people they don't hit the join button or they leave because they
Mhm.
don't want to do breakout rooms, which I have been guilty of doing in the past.
Mhm.
Hopefully you got really good one-on-one interactions with people.
No, definitely. I started with like 5 and then I'm like, oh, they left. Oh, they came back. Oh, they left. But
Yeah.
our conversation was still pretty good despite the smaller 3 people.
I'm so glad. That's the goal, right? This, we're all learning in this digital age how to like actually convene people in a digital space, and it's
Mhm.
it's really hard when you're at a table to like in person. You feel like you can really share. When you're in a digital breakout room, it's like, oh my gosh, so it's just not quite the same. But hopefully everybody was able to talk. Hopefully they felt like they could interject and say things that were on their minds. Yeah. All right,
Yeah.
great.
Great. So I am wondering if folks, if there's anyone that wants to talk about what are the ways that you came up with to engage in sexual violence prevention. You can share in the chat too. So if that is something that, if you're more comfortable sharing in the chat, then that's totally fine as well. Perfect. Someone said deconstructing societal expectations. That's a great one. Yes, so teaching your 1.5-year-old daughter that the importance of consent and boundaries, that's perfect. Advocate, let's see, oh, they're coming in fast now. Okay, let's see. Advocate and be an ally in an instance where young girls may not feel like they can speak up for themselves. Teaching my future children about consent early on, which is great. We can raise girls who know their worth and boys who don't feel like they have to match the current norm, which is also a great example. Let's see, how to start the conversation, just having conversation with folks, lots of education, listen without judgment, think about societal expectations and how they impact people, thinking about social structures. And also, yes, teaching boys about bystander intervention and consent, and girls about finding their voice and boundaries of consent. So these are really great examples. I'm so glad so many of you came to that conclusion. That's what I was hoping for. I have a couple more examples. So for all of you who maybe not know, a really great way if you're running meetings is to ask for pronouns or ask for people if they would like to include their pronouns, to do so at like second nature. Anytime you have a meeting, name, pronouns, job, name, pronouns, job, name, pronouns, job. So it becomes second nature. We're respecting bodily autonomy. So a really common one is to never force a child to hug another person. This is difficult. I have a 6-year-old niece who I love so much, and it's really painful when she doesn't want to give me a hug. And I'm like, why? I deserve a hug, but it's not about my feelings. It's about respecting her autonomy, right? So we always ask, Kaya, can I have a hug before I leave? And sometimes she says no, and sometimes she says yes. Sometimes she gives me 2, right? So this is something that has been, it's really hard to address. It's such a part, like I remember my parents always saying like, hug your grandparents before we leave, right? So really normalizing that conversation with family members. Can I give you a hug? can I give you a high five? Can I give you a thumbs up, right? And offering a variety. Being an upstander, so intervening if we see violence committed against another. Highly encourage increased education, so on gender norms, what does that really look like? Racism, sexism, ableism, because they're so intrinsically tied together. Learning about rape culture, learning about systemic and cultural values that perpetuate sexual violence and how to address them. And then, as always, we're believing survivors when they come forward about sexual assault. And it can be challenging, and sexual assault is rampant, and it's committed by all kinds of people, not just strangers in the night that are coming out of the alleyways, but often it's committed by family members and family friends and colleagues, right? So it's important. We like to shove it off and say like, oh, it's not happening here. It's not, that would never happen. But unfortunately, most commonly sexual assault is someone that you already know. So I have a slide of resources I would highly encourage you to explore. So Disclosure is an amazing documentary that was released a couple months ago on Netflix. It is about trans folks. And I learned so much in this documentary. It's really well done and uses lots of pop culture and about how we learn and think about trans people, and how it's really led to a misinformation narrative about trans folks. So I'd highly encourage that. Consent for Kids, I think I have it. It's right here. It's seriously so cute. It's geared towards elementary kids, but honestly, everyone should read it. It's adorable. So like just an example of, it's like kind of comic book writing. So this page says, for people who have their own reasons for dressing the way they do, feels cold, doesn't want to be recognized, is hiding their dog in there, clothing isn't consent. And so there's like a cute little cartoon about people in their little parkas. So just lots of really great, I bought this for my niece. The Hunting Ground is about it's really talking about the culture of entitlement. And this is geared towards college. So it's on HBO right now, and I think available on Amazon, or you can rent it on Amazon. And it's a documentary about a group of people that sued the Department of Education for Title IX violations regarding sexual assault, and talks about the cultures amongst fraternities and athletics, which gives the sense of entitlement regarding sexual assault. This book I have right here, Arrested Justice, Black Women Violence in America's Prison Nation. It's written by a Black woman, and it's really well done, specifically talking about sexual violence and racism and how that interplays with the prison industrial complex. And then Push Out, which is an amazing read. There's also a documentary out. It's by Monique Morris, and it talks about the criminalization of Black girls in schools, and often, comes into play with the hypersexualization of Black girls from a really young age. So another really important read, or read and or watch. I'm listening to it as an audiobook. So these are just a few things that I would recommend, starting for a variety of unlearning reasons. There's a million more resources out there. So if you have very specific questions, or you can always get in contact with me. And then I just want to offer the space for any questions. And then I would love, since this content is difficult, I would love for people to put in the chat how you're going to take care of yourself today, or practice a little self-care, have a hot tea, drink lots of water, take a bath, watch something really good on Netflix. Like, how are you going to take care of yourself after learning about some of this really heavy content? And then also, if you have any questions about the content we covered today, I am here for a few more minutes.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
Hi. So it's okay to speak?
Yes, yes, of
Right,
course.
Yeah, and I just wanted to speak on the fact you mentioned about not to force our kids or just force any young person to hug or in the 90s, I think this was around about 94 or 5. I know I was stationed in California. My husband and I are both military, ex-Navy. But we were meeting my sister for an event. My daughter was just like 2 years old, and she's always been kind of standoffish with people. So I was meeting my sister and her boyfriend, and this was a new guy. We had never seen him before, Irvin. And I did that. When we were saying our goodbyes, my daughter was very skittish and standoffish, and she didn't want to hug him. And I'm like, give him a hug, give him a hug. And it just kind of set my husband off. So he is just like, don't force her to do that. My thinking was, oh God, we're going to offend him. But I learned not even years later, I learned after the fact. We spoke about it and with our kids on our drive home, because I said to him, why did you do that? Why were you so rude? And especially in front of, you didn't have to be that rude. And he's kind of like that anyway. He doesn't hold back his, my husband is very laid back though. But he's the type that something that serious, he's not going to, sure, he's just going to get it out there. So anyway, I appreciate it in the end, but when he initially, I was like, yeah, I was a little upset by it. But then I learned, it was in the 90s, kind of before its time, but he was absolutely correct.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of times we don't talk about how uncomfortable it is to address some of the norms that are so common and acknowledge them as contributing to sexual violence. None of us want to commit harm. We care about our kids, we care about our grandkids, we care about our nieces or nephews or family members or family friends, right? So I think that's what just that feeling, like, I don't want people to spiral. Like, if you have done that, please do not spiral into like oh no, like I'm committing sexual, it's like, no, we can do less harm in the future. That's why we acknowledge it. And there are so many other great ways, right? Like talking about consent. Like if you have a baby, you can tell them, I'm going to change your diaper now. Like you can teach your kids the correct names of their genitals. And that all is protective measures for sexual violence or sexual abuse. And so we can we can know better and we can do better. And we can just acknowledge and be like, I didn't know any better. That just was the way. I mean, my whole life, my parents have been that way, right? And so once we know better, and like my parents now will never force their granddaughter to give them a hug. And that's all that it is. But I think it's also okay to be like, oh crap, like I have perpetuated, like we've all perpetuated these norms, right? And that's totally just part of how we've grown up in this culture. And so, like we said, I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that, because I think that is the tough piece about addressing the norms, is like when something has just always been done, it's hard to acknowledge it as maybe potentially being harmful, especially when you don't intend it to be harmful, right?
Yeah, and so that's what I saw. It. My husband was pretty brave to speak out in that manner, and it helped me more when he explained to me why, because I just didn't see it. Like you said, it was so normal to give a sister and the boyfriend. No, we didn't know him, but as soon as my husband said to me, "Well, if she has a reason she's feeling that way. If she doesn't feel, she is." That way, that's her instincts, and I know all about instincts, so I don't know why it didn't click.
It just happens, right? And I think about social emotional learning, and I'm really fortunate that kids are getting that experience. Like I never had a school counselor in elementary school, but my niece learned all about like growing a balloon and breathing into a balloon and exhaling and all of these like regulation behaviors that are so amazing. And I think about how we don't teach kids to trust their gut. And their
Yeah.
gut, your gut, 90% of your nerves are like in your stomach, basically. Like it's a huge bundle of nerves in your, I don't even know, I can't remember what it's called, but
Yeah.
so many of your nerves are in your gut. And so there is something to be said, like when something doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel right. And for so long, we have not taken that really seriously. And I think we're starting to shift so that
Yeah.
kids can also start to be in tune with their bodies and be like, something is telling me
Yeah.
something is off, right? And
I
I just want to
also
encourage
say
that.
really quickly, the same thing with the doctors. We had a doctor that she was that way with too. The same daughter. Well, I only have one daughter, 2 sons and a daughter, but she was like that. And it's the same with your with medical caregivers. You also, that's another norm. Oh, yeah, be this way. But then we did learn that too. And the doctor in the end, I understood. We were sensitive with it, but we did not force her to until she was comfortable. I mean, but doctors, they have to have some type of they have to be close to you to examine you, is what I'm trying to say. But we spoke with her about it, and we still did not force her. We waited until she was comfortable.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some really great doctors too that are incorporating new practices where they're explaining everything that they're doing, right? I'm going to feel your tummy. I'm going to feel your under your armpit. I'm going to feel your leg.
Yeah.
And like, I highly encourage that, right? If your child has like a medical issue and you have to check out a part of their body, telling them what you're going to do and why, like, is so important. And I think a lot of times we don't want to, I don't know why it is. I think we infantilize kids for a really long time and think that they're not ready to have these conversations when kids are really receptive to learning about themselves, their bodies, their feelings. And so allowing space for that is a really great thing.
Yeah. So I thank you for bringing it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Is anybody else have any other questions? The vagus nerve is what it is. Thank you.
Andrea, this is Anne, and I just have a comment more than anything. Just gratitude for everything that you shared today. I know at our coalition, as your new program unfolds and gets piloted, we would love to sort of go along with you in the learning. There's going to be so many great policies that get changed as a result, and we're super interested in how we share that sort of over here folks are learning this, does it apply over here, because I think you are really going to be at the front edge of challenging a lot of the like you said, the school dress codes and things like that we know that that will be, you'll learn so much. So thank you for your leadership in learning that. And we want to walk with you. So let us know how we can, can back you up.
Well, luckily Tristan is on my advisory board, which is really great. And so Tristan gets a front row seat to we've done quite a bit of pivoting right now because of COVID also. So it's been an interesting year trying to adapt. But definitely, I think the benefit, this is the piece that I missed, I didn't say earlier, is policies that change or the ones that we create will hopefully become the new model policies for the state, which is a really great thing, and how it will directly impact schools across the state and potentially the country. So yeah, I'm really excited, and I appreciate everyone's kind words and nods and claps, and this is my favorite part of my job. So thanks for inviting me, and lovely to see all of you. And like I said, I'll put my first slide up really quickly while you finish up with my contact information. Let me actually do that really quickly. Okay, let's see. All right, so here is my cell and my email. So feel free to contact me if you have any other questions or need resources. If you text me, make sure to put your name and where I met you, just because I won't have your number or anything. So yeah, so great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tristan, for connecting me. And I hope you all have a restful day. I loved all of your self-care ideas. I'm gonna watch something after and enjoy the rain. I love the rain, so.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea. Can we get another like a round of applause? I'll do sign language. Yeah. So amazing. I don't know, that was just empowering, but also made me like question a lot of things. I really appreciate how you provided a lot of information. And like it was overwhelming, but like in the good way, like the overwhelming to motivate me to do more, you know? So yeah, I really appreciate, and we all really appreciate you, Andrea, for bringing your wisdom and expertise to us. Um, and now I will pass the mic over to Tristan, Justice for Girls program coordinator, to close out the summit. Tristan is an amazing person. Um, I know she's not going to say this herself, but she works so hard, and she's been working really hard on this entire Beyond Pink Summit. So please give her a warm welcome. Tristan, woohoo!
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much. Andrea, thank you. That training was absolutely incredible. I could listen to you talk all day, every day. I'm sure you wouldn't want that, but I would love that. So thank you very much. So we wanted to highlight a few additional resources. Again, I'll be emailing you tomorrow or Friday if I get lazy tomorrow. But we have some really great mental health and health resources that we have gathered throughout our year, looking into the ways that we can prevent violence. So this is a great slide. Don't worry about capturing all this information. Like I said, I'll send it to you. And we also have resources for victims of violence and victims of substance abuse. So I think that's a really important topic that we didn't really touch on today, but we love to be able to share resources that our experts in the field have shared with us. So I will be following up with all of you with these resources soon. And as with all JFG programming, we really value your feedback. So if you could spare 2 minutes right after we conclude, that's the best time to do it. It's fresh in your head, you're energized. Could you please fill out this link? I think this is the active one here, Google Forms. Yes. So if you could please click on that just so that it loads in the background. And then you can spend 2 to 3 minutes filling it out. Like I said, we really appreciate your feedback, and it makes us a better coalition. So please take the time to do that. And lastly, I just want to thank a lot of people who made this day possible. So I'd like to start with thanking Cherise Hopkins for her stirring keynote presentation this morning. If you didn't hear that presentation, you have to watch the replay. That was absolutely incredible. And again, thank you to Andrea Wessel at OSPI for absolutely blowing it out of the water with your training. Thank you to our incredible youth speakers, Chardonnay Beaver and Savannah Parker, for courageously sharing their stories and their talents with us. Thank you to the JFG board members whose collective efforts guide our mission forward. Thank you to Anne Muno, JFG's executive director and visionary leader, who brings passion, thoughtfulness, and drive to everything she does for girls in the state. The following remarkable humans volunteered their time to facilitate breakout rooms today. So I'd like to just shout out Adanech Muno, Bethlehem Muno, Ella Cook, Kelly Gaylord, Julia Kagochi, and Lana Sturmer. A lot of them are just my friends and I kind of roped them into this. So thank you so much for coming and for facilitating. And can we please show some snaps or emojis or give it up for our exceptional youth program and training facilitators, Amara Anderson, Jaya Duckworth, and Haley Gray, who never cease to amaze me with their profound dedication to ensuring that JFG is truly youth-led. And certainly, and last but certainly not least, thank you to each and every single one of you for your tireless efforts to center the needs of girls and gender-expansive youth in your work. Only by working together are we going to be able to achieve our collective goals of dismantling systems of oppression, eliminating injustice, achieving racial equity, and ensuring that youth thrive in your communities in Washington and across the US. So thank you so much for attending the summit today and being youth justice champions. And one last thing before we adjourn, I would love to get a photo, like a screenshot photo of all of you. Now, if you're not feeling like having your picture taken today, now is the time to turn off your video, but we would love to commemorate this day with a quick snapshot. So when you're ready, I'll give you a little notice. Let me go into gallery mode and full screen. It's not working. Let me try it on this one. There we are. Okay, and I'll give you a countdown. And 3, 2, 1. Yay! Thank you so much, everybody. That's our contact information if you have any questions, and I will be following up with an email tomorrow or Friday. So thank everybody. Be safe. Take care.
Thank you guys. Bye.
Thanks,
So
everybody.
much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
You too.
You too.